Welcome to an Odyssey in Mixology and to the first part of my segment on old fashions. In this video, I'm going to compare 9 different budget bourbons to see which one makes the best classic old-fashioned cocktail. Now, if you haven't liked and subscribed, then please do so, but above all else, enjoy. Of all the cocktails in existence, there are only 3 that are globally known regardless of your interest in drinking. Margaritas are the most fun, martinis are the fanciest, but an old-fashioned is the most classic. It's the most famous cocktail of all time because of its simplicity, its history, and the fact that it's just downright delicious. There are a lot of variations, both simple and complex, of the old-fashioned, but a common modern recipe is 2 ounces of a 90 proof plus bourbon, 3 dashes of Angostura bitters, a 1/4 ounce of Demerara syrup, all stirred with ice for 20 seconds and strained into a rocks glass. Finally, a generous orange peel garnish should be expressed over the top and wiped on the inside of the glass. A bit of water, a dash of orange bitters, and a maraschino cherry are all fun additions, but I'm choosing this simplified recipe to keep the focus on the bourbon itself. This is obviously a very easy drink to make, but the origin story for the old-fashioned is over 200 years long. It's actually fairly straightforward to piece its history together, but it's quite a bit harder to give credit to any one person. In 1690, Dr. Richard Stoughton released his custom bitters called the Elixir Magnum Stomachicum. As with most bitters of the time, these were intended to be medicinal, but they contain similar ingredients to today's aromatic bitters. Dr. Stoughton recommended using these bitters with brandy, wine, and sugar to create an alternate to a common beverage of the time called Pearl. Now, this isn't necessarily the first time that this recipe was created and drunk, but it's the first documented version of something similar to today's old-fashioned. Over 100 years later, and about the time Pearl started fading in popularity due to beer becoming more common, a New York newspaper released an article that had a drink recipe they called a cocktail. The cocktail was a combination of sugar and any spirit and bitters of the drinker's choosing. Not only is this the first instance of the word cocktail ever, but it's the first time that this type of ratio is recorded using higher proof spirits. Originally, gin would have been the most common spirit to use, but whiskey was becoming more popular, hence the recipe leaving the specifics up in the air. Over the next few decades, the word cocktail would grow to become synonymous with all mixed drinks. The original drink it represented would therefore become officially known as the whiskey cocktail in 1862. With the invention of the Manhattan in the 1880s, the mixed drink craze was in full force, and new riffs and recipes of the whiskey cocktail started to show up. When wanting the original, simpler version, people started ordering the old-fashioned version of the whiskey cocktail. Now, it's at this point that the name old-fashioned converged with the simplified whiskey cocktail recipe, and the two have remained linked ever since. There was a period during Prohibition when spirit quality was poorer, so orange and maraschino cherries were brought in to help detract from the subpar spirits being used. And even though the maraschino cherry and the orange stuck around, the recipe reverted back to a simpler state after Prohibition was lifted. Now, the recipe I mentioned earlier is similar to the 1862 whiskey cocktail, but it's modernized a bit. I'm using a Demerara syrup instead of a gum syrup, and the ratios are changed. Now, gum syrup arguably makes a nicer cocktail, but Demerara syrup is more common, and it's still an improvement over simple syrup. As with the original, the important thing is that a good whiskey is used. A bad whiskey will show through in the final drink, and a great whiskey will be partially wasted. Great whiskey should generally be drunk straight so that it can be appreciated for its natural complexity. As a result, the perfect whiskey for an old-fashioned is one that's budget-friendly, but still of good quality and full flavor. With that in mind, I've chosen 9 different budget bourbons to see which one makes the best old-fashioned per this classic but slightly modernized recipe. The criteria for my picks is that each bottle must be between $20 and $30, each has to be over 85 proof and less than 100 proof, and finally, each must be a Kentucky Straight Bourbon so that the aging is similar and all are additive free. This chart shows each bottle that I've picked, as well as some important info on them. The similarities are evident, but there are differences in mash bills and aging. Now, none of these bourbons have age statements, so the durations I have listed are generally assumed to be the most prevalent age of the bourbon in these blended whiskeys. It's impossible to find accurate info though, so take it with a grain of salt. Something similar can be said with the mash bills. Some mash bills are common knowledge, and others are a secret. I've done my best to assemble values based on the most common info I can find. As a couple disclaimers, I let the Wild Turkey 101 through despite the extra proof point. The Four Roses small batch can be a few dollars more, but I did buy this bottle for $29.99. And although I decided to go with a non-wheated bourbons, I did include Maker's Mark just for the fun data point. Now, I'm not expecting any single bottle to blow the others out of the water, and by that same logic, I'm not really expecting any of these to make a terrible old-fashioned. Whilst there are differences between each of these bottles, I'm expecting the majority of the old-fashions to taste good, but more or less the same drink to drink. What I'm hoping for is that a few of these bottles surprise me and are just slightly better. Now, when factoring in price, a $20 bottle that makes the same quality old-fashioned as a $30 bottle is also better value and should be ranked higher. And then on the other side, if any come out as worse than the majority, then that's a pretty big problem considering the amount of competition between these brands. To remove any differences due to dilution or temperature, I'm going to make all of the old fashions in the glasses and then add half an ounce of icy water to replace the normal stir chilling. And full disclosure, my favorite old-fashioned recipe has more of an emphasis on the cherry and the orange. With this one, lacking those two ingredients, I'm trying to make 9 old-fashions that really only differ by the type of bourbon in them, and that keeps the emphasis on those bourbon notes itself, regardless of when I taste them. So now these have all been mixed with a sanitized spoon in between each of them, and I'm going to go ahead and add the ice cubes in. Once the ice cubes are in, I'm going to bring in the orange garnish, and then I'm going to follow a similar process to some of the other kind of like mass cocktail comparison videos that I've done. I'm going to go through every single cocktail very quickly and kind of talk about my gut reaction to each of them before circling back around and going into a little bit more detail about each of these drinks. All right, so it's a really good, very straightforward old-fashioned. There aren't really any properties of that that stand out, but it kind of checks all the boxes for what I'm looking for in an old-fashioned. The Maker's Mark is different, and it's the only wheated bourbon up here, and that does kind of show through. It's got a little bit more fruit in it, but more so than anything else, I taste the extra wheat, the extra grain that's been added into it. That tastes slightly darker and a little bit more spiced than the other two. Four Roses small batch. I get a bit more kind of like a bitter chocolate on that one. And that one's very wood forward. Extremely wood forward, actually. The Wild Turkey's quite wood forward as well. Not to the same extent as the old Forestor 100. I think this one has a bit more, I wouldn't say complexity to it, but there's more, a little more spice, a little more chocolate. It's kind of a mix between the old Forestor and the Four Roses. The Elijah Craig. I get kind of a mellow chocolate on that one. I mean, it's kind of cool. Already I'm seeing differences in all of these, and whilst they are quite similar as I expected, there's enough nuance that this is definitely going to be worth kind of a much more detailed run through on each of these. That's the most chocolate forward by far. And then the Bulleit kind of leans into the spicy side. I'd say it's more in line with, I want to say, the 1792 and the Buffalo Trace. instead of the chocolate forwardness of these and the woodiness of these. So, as I hoped for, all of these old fashions are decent, but what makes them decent? And what am I really looking for in an old fashioned? Well, I'm obviously looking for a higher proof cocktail that retains the nice qualities of a bourbon. And generally, I would say that is subtle vanilla, spice, heavy oakiness, and for some bourbons, a dark red fruit like cherry. And these characteristics are present in most bourbons. However, as with all of these up here, they haven't really aged long enough to develop that really powerful red cherry flavor that you'd see in like the George T. Stagg over there. That being said, in general, the spice from the Angostura bitters works with the orange oil to balance out the bourbon's oakiness with, let's say, equal parts a dark clovish finish, and then the bright citrus from the orange peel itself. It's a really nice combination. There's a reason this is the most classic of all cocktails. Now, choosing bottles over 80 proof is also my decision, and that ultimately just makes these a little bit punchier. They might dilute just as quickly as an 80 proof bourbon, but the flavor is a little bit more concentrated to start with. And obviously that makes for a more flavorful drink over time, especially when the ice is such a big part of an old fashioned. Now, as I said, none of these bourbons have aged long enough to release heavy red fruit flavors. And the lack of cherry means that the complexity that is obvious in all of these is kind of limited to the changes in oak, chocolate, vanilla, spice flavors. And that's pretty much it. The citrus level is about the same in all of these. Obviously, the Angostura bitters bring the same flavor to each of these. And so what I'm really tracking is the differences from the bourbons themselves. Now, if I wasn't doing a bourbon comparison, I would prefer to add a dash of orange bitters and some of the maraschino cherry syrup, but this is still a clean and simple way to enjoy an elevated bourbon. So let's circle back around to each of these and go into a bit more detail. Overall, it's pretty clean, it's very balanced. There's nothing really jumping out as necessarily interesting or bad about it. It's a very solid bourbon, and that's obvious because it's a very solid old fashioned, but that kind of leans into the more non-distinct side of a bourbon in that everything is there, there's nothing surprising. It's good, it's just not super interesting. So as I mentioned, Maker's Mark is the one wheated bourbon up here, and it's just kind of an interesting data point. Wheated bourbons generally develop red fruit flavors faster than a non-wheated bourbon. I do get some kind of bitter cherry on some of these, specifically the Old Forestor 100, but it's more pronounced here. The caveat to that is that the chocolate and oak flavors which are present in most of these are reduced here as well. And that frankly makes a good old fashioned, but honestly, if the recipe was changed to include a maraschino cherry, then the focus switches from kind of, oh, this has some cherry in it compared to the others, to, oh, this is missing some of the chocolate and wood that's common across everything else. So good old fashioned, but it lacks some of what I want in an old fashioned, which is what I find in generally non-wheated bourbons. All right, the 1792. So the 1792 seems to lean into the spice side a bit more than some of these other ones. In that regard, it's more similar to the Buffalo Trace in that it's not giving high oak or chocolate or cherry notes. It's leaning into the spiciness, and that's good. That's not a bad thing. I think the Buffalo Trace is balanced a little bit better, but that also makes the Buffalo Trace ever so slightly less interesting than 1792, even if neither is giving me that kind of pop of flavor in the old fashioned itself. The Four Roses has a dark chocolatey flavor and what I would say moderate oak. And that's getting a lot nearer to what I'm looking for in an old fashioned. It still has the nice spice of the 1792 and the Buffalo Trace, but it's bringing in that chocolate flavor, which just goes wonderfully with the other ingredients. And frankly, for someone who likes chocolate in their old fashioned, I'm not talking about chocolate liqueur or chocolate infusion or chocolate syrup, just the hints of dark chocolate from the barreling process. This is really good. So the Old Forester has similar, very, very light chocolate notes, but where this really excels is on the oakiness itself. This has the highest oak out of everything that I remember trying, both in my quick glance as well as in my more detailed look at the flavor. This is very oak forward. There is a little bit of chocolate. There's a little bit of bitter cherry in there, and it's a very good old fashioned. And this is kind of what I'm looking for flavor wise, more so than what I've tried so far. That being said, the oak isn't necessarily a forward flavor that everyone is looking for. And from that standpoint, I think this is more interesting than the others, but that extra interest makes it maybe a little more polarizing. So I think the Wild Turkey 101 is kind of the assumed king of budget bourbons. And there's pretty good reason for that. It's a very good old fashioned, and by default, that means it's a very good bourbon. I'd say it's less oak forward than the Old Forester. The proof is nice. I like the fact that both of these are basically 100 proof. And this one's the right balance of oak and chocolate and spice, a little bit of vanilla. I don't really get red fruit on this one as I do with the Old Forester to an extent, but the bright sourness of this one does kind of leave you with hints of red fruit. So the Elijah Craig has notes of milk chocolate, which is a little unique because the other chocolate forward ones on here, specifically the Four Roses and the Woodford Reserve, I think lean towards dark chocolate. They're a little bit more bitter. They have more of a depth to that chocolate flavor. This one seems to balance the smoothness of that chocolate flavor along with the higher sweetness. I don't get much red fruit here. The spice is tamed down. And again, when I say milk chocolate, I'm talking about the subtle hints of chocolate flavoring in the whiskey itself. And obviously that's coming from the barrel. It's coming from the caramelization in the char of the barrel mixed in with the wood. But whereas the Old Forester gives a wood forward presence, for this one, it's more of a smooth, sweet, gentler wood, which again comes off as milk chocolate. So for the Woodford Reserve, slightly sharper, but more full in that chocolate flavor. I think between the three of these kind of chocolate forward old fashions, the Woodford Reserve has the most dark chocolate flavor. I think it's also got kind of in the middle oak. I think the Four Roses has the most oak between the three of these, and let's say middle dark chocolate. I think the chocolate here is a little bit more bitter. It reminds me less of a smoother milk chocolate because the spice is a bit more prevalent. For the Elijah Craig, I think this has the lowest oak of the three of these. And I think the chocolate is just so much more sweet. It reminds me of milk chocolate with a little bit of sourness at the end of it. And so I think that's a really interesting comparison between these three because it's fairly often that I see comparisons between Elijah Craig, Woodford Reserve, and Four Roses. And it always seems like the winner is kind of up in the air. And I think that's really based on the chocolate versus oak versus type of chocolate that people individually prefer. It's not overly interesting. I don't get the chocolate or necessarily the oakiness that is prevalent on some of these. That seems to lean a bit more towards the spice side. And from that standpoint, I'd say that moves into a category along with the 1792 and the Buffalo Trace. So which one of these stands out? And if we say that the old-fashioned made from these budget bourbons average a 5 out of 10, I would say none of them go past 7.5 and none of them go lower than a 4. They kind of fall into three distinct categories for me though. I mean, we have the oak forward ones, the chocolate forward ones, and the ones that are just kind of non-distinct. Now, non-distinct isn't necessarily bad. They rely more on the spice side of a bourbon profile rather than any of the individual flavors. So which bourbon is best very much comes down to what you're looking for in an old-fashioned. If what you care about is flavor intensity, then the Woodford Reserve is the best if you want a more chocolate-forward profile. The Old Forester is best if you're looking for a wood-forward profile. And I think the Buffalo Trace embodies the expected but basic flavors from a bourbon. It's less interesting, but it ticks all of the boxes in a kind of an equal manner. Now, the Maker's Mark is in a bit of its own category, and it was kind of just a fun data point to add. In a future video, I'm going to compare different wheated bourbons, so for this one, I'm going to compare it to the rest of these rather than its intensity against other wheated bourbons. So that's the easy answer, but the difficult answer is which one is the best overall. At that point, it's less about which old fashioned has the strongest single flavor, and more about which old fashioned has the right combination of flavor, intensity, and balance. Of the spice-forward old fashions, the Buffalo Trace and the Bulleit versions are the most balanced, however the one with Bulleit has weaker flavors. The 1792 version is more spice-forward than either, but that makes it a bit sharper and less smooth than the Buffalo Trace one. For the Maker's Mark Old Fashioned, the wheated recipe shows through with a bit more red fruit than the others, but at the expense of the oak, chocolate, and spice flavors. It's still good, but the flavor is less full and it's less balanced. This chart ranks the bourbons based on flavor alone, but price is important even if this is a small range. The 1792 and the Maker's Mark are the cheapest bourbons here, and they could easily deserve to be boosted by a full point because of the value they have. The chocolate-forward Old Fashions are all consistently good and for different reasons. The Elijah Craig version is the sweetest and smoothest Old Fashioned, whilst the Four Roses and the Woodford Reserve versions bring darker and slightly sharper flavors forward. The one with Four Roses balances dark chocolate with oak, whilst the Woodford Reserve creates the most bitter and intense dark chocolate flavor in the cocktail. Of these three, I like the flavor profile from the Woodford Reserve the most. That being said, the others could just as easily be seen as better depending on your personal preferences. That just leaves the two highest proof and oak-forward budget bourbons as the best ones for an old fashioned. I think the heavy emphasis on the oak in the Old Forestor 100 version is wonderful, especially when paired with the bitters and the orange. It's my favorite of all 9 bourbons up here. It lacks some of the chocolate notes from the others, but it makes up for it with subtle bitter cherry notes. Now, the Wild Turkey 101 Old Fashioned has less fruit notes, but it better balances the high oak against subtle chocolate and rye spice. It's also a few dollars cheaper, and I think it deserves its first place win. Now, both of these have the right amount of subtle complexity in the classic bourbon flavors, both straight and in an old fashioned. They're a bit different, but they're both exceedingly smooth and make great old fashions. Now, although I prefer the Old Forestor 100, the Wild Turkey 101 is just more rounded out. It makes a slightly better old fashioned that will be a bit less interesting than the Old Forestor, and for that matter, some of the other chocolate forward bottles. But this bourbon creates the characteristics that most people would look for in an old fashioned. It has the right amount of intensity in the individual flavors, such that it's very balanced but still unique. It has a price point exactly in the middle of the range, the highest proof of the bunch, and the availability to be found literally everywhere, whereas the Old Forestor 100 is maybe a bit more rare. That's it for my video on finding the best budget bourbon for classic old fashioned, but it's not my last video on old fashions. In the next part of this segment, I'm going to compare 8 different old fashioned recipes using the Wild Turkey 101 to see which is the best overall. If you haven't liked and subscribed, then please do so, but above all else, thank you so much for watching. Cheers.